The 21st of October, 1944. Soviet forces crossed into East Prussia, moving swiftly across the Angerapp River. In the quiet village of Nemmersdorf, German civilians had no warning. By the time the soldiers withdrew, homes were destroyed and dozens lay dead, a shocking glimpse of war arriving on German soil for the first time. Quick pause, tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe and like if you're enjoying the story. Let's continue. Soviet units briefly occupied it on 21 October before withdrawing. German forces returned days later, finding extensive destruction, civilian deaths, and material loss recorded in contemporary evidence. The Soviet advance over the Angerapp River was tactically limited and short-lived. German counterattacks forced a withdrawal within 48 hours, leaving Nemmersdorf exposed. The village remained unoccupied until German troops and civilians re-entered the area during subsequent operations. Upon return, German soldiers encountered damaged homes, looted interiors, broken doors, and signs of shelling. Bodies of civilians were discovered inside houses, courtyards, and farm structures, indicating violence occurred during the brief Soviet presence rather than later fighting. Medical personnel and military investigators were dispatched to Nemmersdorf by German authorities. Examinations recorded multiple civilian deaths, including elderly women, children, and men. The findings emphasized close-range killings, blunt force injuries, and gunshot wounds occurring within domestic spaces. Autopsy summaries circulated internally, described trauma consistent with physical assault, though full forensic details were not publicly released. The arrangement of bodies and damaged interiors suggested organized violence rather than random crossfire, according to contemporary German medical observations. The Nemmersdorf findings were rapidly incorporated into official German communiques. Photographs, film footage, and written testimonies were compiled and sent to Berlin for review. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, ordered extensive dissemination through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public exhibitions. State media portrayed Nemmersdorf as evidence of Soviet conduct toward German civilians. The village name was repeated in speeches, schools, and printed leaflets, establishing it as a symbolic reference point for the consequences of enemy occupation within German territory. International observers later acknowledged destruction in Nemmersdorf, though interpretations differed. A Hungarian officer accompanying an inspection delegation recorded the scene in a personal diary, describing extensive damage and civilian deaths, without disputing the occurrence of violence. Post-war historians questioned specific numerical claims and photographic presentation, yet generally accepted that civilian killings occurred. The event remained significant, primarily because it represented the first widely documented case of such violence on German soil during the war. As Soviet forces resumed advances elsewhere, German military orders hardened. In some units, reprisals were tolerated and surrender discouraged. Commanders cited Nemmersdorf when justifying severe treatment of enemy soldiers encountered during subsequent engagements along the Eastern Front. The village became a reference in internal communications, reinforcing a perception of existential threat. For many German soldiers, memoirs later described the event as altering their understanding of the war, transforming it from territorial defense into perceived civilian survival. By April 1945, Soviet armies advanced toward Berlin under Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev. The offensive aimed to capture the capital quickly. Soviet artillery bombarded the city heavily, collapsing infrastructure and overwhelming remaining German defensive formations. Civilians sheltered in basements, subways, and cellars amid continuous fighting. German command structures disintegrated. Communications failed, evacuation efforts collapsed, and municipal services ceased functioning, leaving large populations trapped within contested urban zones. Street fighting in Berlin erased clear front lines. Soviet units advanced block by block, encountering resistance from regular troops, Volkssturm, and armed youths. Buildings were cleared with explosives, grenades, and small arms fire, regardless of civilian presence. Large sections of the city were destroyed. Water, electricity, and food supplies collapsed. Bodies remained uncollected in streets. Civilians relied on improvised shelters and informal mutual aid as organized authority disappeared entirely. Following military collapse, Soviet occupation initially lacked effective discipline. Some units engaged in widespread looting and abuse. Warehouses, homes, and public buildings were stripped. Alcohol consumption among troops worsened disorder, according to multiple contemporary accounts. Attempts by Soviet officers to impose control occurred unevenly. In some areas, guards were posted and limits enforced. In others, chaos persisted until formal occupation structures were gradually established during the weeks following the city's surrender. German civilians developed survival strategies, including hiding, movement restrictions, and seeking protection from individual officers. Some arrangements involved proximity to authority figures in exchange for security, a practice documented in post-war testimonies. These arrangements varied widely and offered no guarantees, reflecting immediate survival calculations rather than ideological alignment. Reports from Berlin hospitals in May 1945 recorded rising numbers of women treated for trauma, infections, and internal injuries. Physicians noted patterns inconsistent with accidents. Internal files used neutral clinical language amid shortages, overcrowding, and collapsing administrative systems nationwide. Patients often arrived without formal statements, accompanied by relatives or neighbors. Care focused on stabilizing conditions using limited supplies. Follow-up was inconsistent, and some cases ended without official certification, reflecting institutional breakdown rather than medical judgment during wartime collapse. Special registries in certain hospitals tracked unwanted pregnancies resulting from assaults. Files listed ages, conditions, and dates. Procedures occurred under emergency conditions, with scarce anesthesia, sterilization, or recovery space, contributing to elevated medical risks for civilian women during the occupation period. Abortions were performed rapidly with reused instruments and minimal aftercare, according to surviving records. Many patients were discharged immediately. Some returned with complications. Others died without formal attribution. As wartime mortality overwhelmed filing systems across Berlin districts during late spring, informal support networks formed among women within residential buildings. Neighbors shared bandages, boiled water, herbal remedies, and basic care. Meetings occurred quietly, without official sanction, providing limited relief amid persistent fear and scarcity. German propaganda intensified during early 1945, emphasizing fear of Soviet capture. Broadcasts described alleged atrocities, urging resistance. Loudspeakers, leaflets, and newspapers repeated warnings portraying surrender as catastrophic for civilians, regardless of personal conduct. Within the Red Army, political messaging framed the invasion as retribution. Pamphlets, speeches, and training emphasized collective German responsibility. References to devastation in Soviet territories encouraged uncompromising behavior. Ambiguous directives allowed excesses to be viewed as spontaneous rather than ordered. Complaints reaching higher command were minimized. Public acknowledgement was avoided while discipline focused primarily on maintaining operational momentum across frontline formations during advancing Soviet armies. Spring 1945. Soviet media dehumanized Germans through language and imagery. Satirical publications depicted enemies as vermin, reinforcing moral distance. Such portrayals reduced perceived civilian distinction and normalized harsh treatment in occupied zones, as part of wartime mobilization narratives sanctioned nationally. Some Red Army officers attempted restraint, issuing local orders protecting civilians or infrastructure. Compliance varied, and enforcement proved inconsistent, given scale, logistics, and alcohol availability within advancing units. Acts of compassion were rare but recorded in post-war testimonies. Captured German cities experienced initial occupation phases lacking administration. Patrols were irregular, and rules unclear. Civilians navigated daily survival amid shifting authority until Soviet command structures stabilized gradually over subsequent weeks. Looting, requisitioning, and displacement accompanied stabilization. Efforts to restore utilities, food distribution, and policing proceeded unevenly. Recovery took months and varied by district, reflecting differing effectiveness across urban and rural areas of occupied Germany. Western Allied observers received reports of abuses in Soviet zones. Correspondents faced censorship. Many accounts were withheld to preserve alliance cohesion, and celebratory narratives surrounding victory in Europe during late April and May. 1945. Medical and military logs in Allied areas noted injured German civilians. Formal investigations were avoided. Testimonies were archived quietly, limiting contemporaneous public awareness of events occurring within adjacent Soviet-occupied territories during transitional administration phases. Private diaries, letters, and later memoirs preserved details absent from government files. These sources documented patterns corroborated across regions, providing post-war historians essential material for reconstruction of civilian experiences. The resulting historical record remains complex, shaped by propaganda, censorship, and trauma. Yet chronology, names, places, and outcomes are established through cross-referenced evidence, forming the basis for continued scholarly examination within 20th-century European war studies. Spring 1945 brought mass evacuations from East Prussia as Soviet forces advanced. Civilians fled westward under military orders or spontaneously seeking safety. Trains, roads, and rivers became congested with displaced populations, moving towards safer territories amid uncertain conditions. Families carried essential possessions, often leaving homes behind. Local authorities recorded numbers and destinations. Emergency shelters were set up in towns along evacuation routes. Temporary accommodations strained resources, creating additional hardship. Diaries and reports indicate that logistical failures exacerbated civilian vulnerability. Medical sources from East Prussia hospitals describe injuries, illnesses, and trauma related to displacement. Refugees presented with malnutrition, respiratory infections, and psychological stress. Officials noted conditions without attributing causation beyond environmental and wartime factors. Relief agencies distributed food, medicine, and blankets, according to available capacity. Constraints were recorded in official statements. Reports revealed differential support between urban centers and rural areas. Chronic shortages and uneven aid contributed to ongoing hardship for civilians moving westward away from front lines. Soviet military orders emphasized securing strategic points and supply lines while encountering resistance. Sporadic engagement with retreating German units occurred. Dispatches described troop movements, logistical coordination, and local administration without reference to individual acts beyond documented combat and occupation responsibilities. Field notes indicate discipline measures were issued to maintain order. Commanders recorded enforcement and corrective measures in messages to higher headquarters. Diaries of officers corroborate structured implementation of occupation policies, emphasizing control of towns, villages, and transport hubs during the final weeks of the Eastern Front campaign. Local councils in East Prussia tried to resume governance under occupation. Officials logged population numbers, infrastructure status, and resource allocation. Municipal registries preserved dates of civilian arrivals, departures, and deaths, offering chronological evidence of civilian management during transition from combat to occupation. Education, sanitation, and public works resumed slowly. Records show elementary schools reopened and offices functioned intermittently. Medical services attempted continuity, although shortages persisted. These entries reflect practical adaptation rather than commentary, providing insight into societal reorganization under occupation. The village of Nemmersdorf became a site of documented military engagement in October 1944. Reports from German military sources describe Soviet incursion details, units involved, and casualty assessments. Casualty lists, unit movements, and dates provide chronological verification. Berlin, after liberation and surrender in May 1945, underwent administrative restructuring. Soviet, American, British, and French commands established occupation zones. Reports document dates of authority, transfer, infrastructure assessment, and civilian compliance, providing chronological accounts of governance in post-war metropolitan Germany. Census and housing updates from May to June 1945 reflect population movement, destruction assessment, and allocation of resources. These materials provide statistical insight into civilian distribution, urban recovery, and resumption of essential services. Medical and police logs in Berlin recorded injuries, deaths, and displacement related to combat aftermath, shortages, and occupational movements. Notes emphasize clinical detail without attributing individual motives or dramatizing events. Temporary shelters and hospitals received displaced populations based on capacity. Reports indicate numbers treated, interventions administered, and logistical challenges. Evidence demonstrates organized responses constrained by resource limits and scale of population movement. Censorship policies, directed by Allied and Soviet authorities, shaped public reporting of wartime and immediate post-war events. Newspapers, press releases, and official statements reflect deliberate omission of civilian suffering. Coverage focused on rebuilding rather than acknowledging specific incidents of violence. Historians analyzing Nemmersdorf, Berlin, and East Prussian evacuations reconstruct events using diaries, military logs, and municipal files. Cross-referencing sources establishes factual chronology while excluding unverified or dramatized content. Archives opened after 1991 allowed comparison of Soviet, German, and Allied records previously inaccessible. Researchers documented civilian experiences systematically, enabling verification of dates, troop movements, and relief measures. Evidence-based conclusions demonstrate scale and patterns of occupation-related challenges. Records indicate refugees arriving in Western Germany during mid-1945 encountered reception centers run by Allied authorities. Documentation lists registration dates, assigned shelters, and ration distribution, showing a systematic approach to population management. Final population registers from 1,946 list civilians, returning displaced persons, and resettlement assignments. Documentation provides names, addresses, and registration dates, offering a factual record of demographic changes during post-war normalization. Allied and municipal reports summarize initial stabilization efforts, documenting administration, resource distribution, and public order measures. These records provide a complete, chronological account of early post-war governance, reconstruction, and population management. History is full of untold stories. Subscribe and hit the bell to explore more with us, and share this video so others can see it too. Thank you for watching.